Next, we're going to look at spiritual responses to Enlightenment by both Baptists and Methodists. So we're still talking about roughly the Enlightenment, so 18th century. But to be fair to Baptists, we would certainly want to do that at a Baptist seminary. The Baptists actually started in the 17th century. So they start early in the 17th century, 1609 being the first example of a Baptist church that's more associated with the General Baptist. It is an English church, but it actually is started in the Netherlands. And they were in the Netherlands because of all these issues with the English liturgy and the requirement of the monarch of England that one had to participate in this liturgy to be a full participant in society. And I wish we had time to talk about how drastically that affected Baptists. Now, Baptists were part of a larger group that we could call separatists or nonconformists. These are folks who go beyond what the Puritans are saying. See, the Puritans are not happy with Elizabeth's Via Media. They're not happy with the compromises in the theology on the Lord's Supper, for example, but they are remaining within the Church of England and praying for it to change from the inside out. It doesn't mean they weren't questioning things. That doesn't mean they weren't pressing up against these larger political powers, but they were remaining within the Church of England. The separatists and the nonconformists, they're saying, no, that's not good enough. We have to separate ourselves. And among these nonconformists, the Baptists are pretty much the most radical among all of them. And they sort of gain that reputation for being willing to take on whatever persecution might come their way in separating. And this goes on, at least in terms of full participation in the government. It goes on for quite some time. There are offices that you can't hold if you don't fully participate in the English Lord's, the Church of England's Lord's Supper, for example. Now, around 1638, we have Spilsbury, who's often credited with starting the first particular Baptist church. But I must tell you that there were rumblings, there were things happening with the particular Baptist being the more Calvinist-leaning Baptist. There were rumblings not long after 1609. So really, both of these groups are emerging at about the same time, although technically the General Baptist formed first. Now, I want to suggest to you, this is something you want to make note of, you want to write this down and keep this information handy, that the Baptist nonconformist approach is the logical Christian high point of religious freedom that grew out of the Reformed movement. So it is the logical Christian high point. And we do mean this also in relationship to Enlightenment. I'd suggest this to you as well, that Baptists were more bold in their calls for religious freedom and worship than any reformers preceding them. Now, to set up that idea, I want to share a quote for you from Mark Knoll and his tremendous book, Turning Points, Decisive Movements in the History of Christianity. In fact, many of you, if not all of you, will end up reading this book as part of your history requirements here at the seminary. So here's the quote by Knoll that illustrates this point I'm making about Baptists being bold, more bold in their call than any other reformers. So in the wake of the Reformation, Protestant church-state establishments had replaced Catholic church-state establishments in much of Germany and Switzerland. The Netherlands, England, Scotland, Wales, the Scandinavian countries, and a few principalities in Eastern Europe, such as parts of Hungary. Now, this summative statement, what's being said here is even though reformers had broken away from the Catholic Church, they ended up creating new hierarchies in these various regions. There's all of these little hierarchies that have now popped up across Europe. And even when we're thinking about the most radical among these reformers, Somebody such as John Knox, who ends up being associated with Calvin, but then goes back to Scotland and becomes a church leader, really controls how worship is done in Scotland. Even for Knox, as bold as he is, as willing as he is to break from Catholics and to break from the Church of England liturgy, he still has a conception that within a region, everyone must worship in the same way. In fact, he illustrates this when Mary Tudor is in his region, and she requests that she be allowed to do the Catholic liturgy privately with her entourage. Now, she had some political reasons for this. Perhaps Knox was right to question what her real motive was. But the point I want you to see is he did not allow her to practice liturgy based on her Catholic faith within his region. Because the idea is still, even from the most radical reformers, that everyone within a region is going to practice Christianity the same way. Not so with the Baptist mindset. It's the Baptists who are beginning to conceive of a world, a community, a state, a city, a nation, where people are free to practice worship as their conscience dictates before God, what they believe to be the right biblical response to worship. So don't miss the fact that for us as Baptists, this sort of rejecting of standard liturgies is sort of part and parcel of our whole history as Baptists. We want to be aware of that too, because we want to be sensitive to the fact that we can tend to just reject liturgy without even looking at it carefully, which is why we're doing some of these lectures, so you'll go back and truly consider the liturgy. So I absolutely celebrate the fact that the Baptists were right there at the forefront. They were tip of the spear in terms of celebrating religious freedom, in terms of calling for religious freedom, and even eventually in America leading the way for religious freedom. So we celebrate these realities, but for you folks as worship leaders in training, I also want to be careful to say, if we have the freedom to reject the liturgy, are we truly free if we're not also open to looking at it, incorporating those parts that perhaps are helpful, that perhaps are biblical? So if we're truly free, we want to be free to use the best of ideas from history, toss out what doesn't make sense, and to incorporate what does make sense. We're now going to look at spiritual responses to Enlightenment through the lens of the Methodists. Now, the first thing we want to notice about the rise of Methodism is that there's a connection to pietism. Now we just got through discussing pietism in a previous part of our lecture, but here we have pietism persisting through the Wesleys, and here's how that occurs. John Wesley is traveling to Savannah to be a missionary there, and he's on a boat with Moravians. Now, the Moravians are this same group that I mentioned to you earlier, the Bohemian Brethren, this group of reformers from what is the modern day Czech Republic, who had become a fervent community under Count Zinzendorf's leadership. Well, they are continuing to have influence, and they're sending out missionaries. And Wesley comes in contact with this group. And there's a storm that's happening at sea as he is traveling to America. And he notices that the Moravians, this pietistic group, they're totally calm in the midst of this storm. In fact, they just keep singing hymns. And Wesley asks them about this. And he's like, how do you remain so calm? And one of the leaders tells him that it has to do with their personal faith in Christ. And Wesley is struck by this. It continues to linger in his mind. In fact, his time in Savannah doesn't turn out so good. He's really distraught after his time. He doesn't see the results he hopes to see, and he falls in love with someone, but it doesn't work out. So he's really in a depressed state as he goes back to England. And he's continuing to seek out what is sincere worship, what is sincere relationship with Christ. And he ends up connecting again with these Moravians, some of whom are now in England. And he goes to some of their services. And one particular night, as he's really wrestling all day long this particular day with what the meaning of relationship with Christ is, he goes in, and at a service they're holding, there's a portion of Luther's commentary on Romans that is read. And the Lord just uses this moment. The Lord uses this moment to help Wesley realize that his sins can be atoned for and are atoned for on the cross, and that it's through faith in what Christ did for us on the cross, through his atoning sacrifice, that Wesley can experience forgiveness. So he actually calls this his conversion experience. Now, interestingly, his brother Charles has a very similar experience at a Moravian gathering. We would certainly call this a pietistic gathering in relationship to Luther's commentary on Ephesians. Has a very similar experience. So this is amazing. We would certainly say this is divine intervention to bring these two evangelistically minded brothers to genuine faith in Christ. Now, as Wesley comes to Christ in such a powerful way, he's pretty much done with restrictions by the English church on getting the gospel out. Now, I should point out that one difference between Wesley and the Baptists is Wesley desires to officially stay in the Church of England. In fact, even to his dying days, when his followers are realizing that Methodism has become so big that they've already, for all practical purposes, broken from the Church of England, Wesley is still trying to hold to being a faithful member of the Anglican Church. So you could almost see Wesley as a Puritan. I mean, he's not called that, but he's sort of a very impassioned Puritan in the sense that he doesn't want to leave the church. He wants to see it purified. He wants to see it reformed. And he's quite willing to reject much of the traditionalism. So here's a statement I want you to keep in mind. Make note of this. As you're compiling some notes for the final exam, make note of this. This is another quote that comes from Knoll. Mark Knoll. Quote, "Thus Wesley, like spokesman for the Enlightenment and in opposition to transitions of the Anglican establishment, was an innovator who readily gave up traditions that now seemed old-fashioned." So some of you in the way you lead worship or the worship you're associated with probably love this quote. I mean, here's a guy who's saying we're going to reject tradition in what now seems old-fashioned and move toward this more fervent, passionate engagement with Christ, both in terms of the communication of the gospel, but also in how we worship. Now, of course, music goes hand in hand with this. You've noticed this throughout our history of worship, that musical developments will always go hand in hand, or most often go hand in hand, with major theological developments or major church movements. So we have John's brother Charles, who writes 6,500 hymns. This is an amazing reality. And this quote comes from Eskew and McElrath. Quote, "On every conceivable phase," that Charles wrote 6,500 hymns, quote, "on every conceivable phase of Christian experience and Methodist theology." Here are some of the hymns that Wesley wrote. "And Can It Be?" "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." "Christ the Lord is Risen Today." "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling." Now, I have to say something about Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. This is a hymn that's almost disappeared in our Baptist churches. And I think the reason for it is somewhere along the way, we started associating these lyrics with a tune that I don't think supports the lyrics well. Love divine, all loves excelling, dun, dun, dun. So it's kind of march-like. That's the one I remember singing growing up. But I had the great privilege in 2004 to go to Wales and help celebrate the Welsh revival. We'll talk a little bit about that later in our lectures. But when, in preparing for this trip, I came to understand that the Welsh people sing this rich theology of Wesley, love divine, all loves excelling, to the tune of Hyfrydal, which is our tune for "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." So if you put these words to that tune, love divine, all loves excelling, and wow, you add a few of my kids play violin, you add violin to that, can be really nice in a range of settings. So tremendous hymns of the faith. "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing," Jesus, lover of my soul. So, and you'll notice that these are hymns that are in our Baptist hymn book. In fact, we could make an argument that our Baptist hymn book, in a way, is the original blended worship, because it's blending together all of these influences. You've got great Reformed hymns like "Mighty Fortress is Our God." You've got emphasis on psalm settings in certain portions of our hymnal, although not as much as you would see like in a Presbyterian setting. But you've also got the hymns of Wesley here. You've got the hymns of Watts. So you've got all of these influences. Our Baptist hymnal is in and of itself, in a way, an early example of blended worship. Now, next we're going to look at the Romantic period. And the Romantic period begins around 1820. Once again, it's not as though somebody stands up one day and says, "Oh, it's the Romantic period," and all of a sudden they're going to start doing art in a different way. But no, Romanticism starts around 1820. And I would suggest to you that in many ways Romanticism is a reaction against Enlightenment. Some see Napoleon's march through Europe as one of the things that leads to Romanticism. I would tend to say that, if anything, Romanticism is also a reaction to Napoleon. In some ways, almost similar to the way Pietism and that more heartfelt, emotional response comes out of the German War, that you could see some similarities there with Romanticism. But in what ways is Romanticism a reaction to Enlightenment? Well, I encourage students to think of it this way. Enlightenment, even though a number of topics are dealt with, we talked about Rousseau dealing with the topic of music, science is certainly a huge part of Enlightenment. There's this idea that science is finally going to answer all of our questions. In fact, that should be funny to us, because we still think in these terms. We think based on new scientific discoveries that we finally reached this zenith of human experiences, and we can deal with anything as humans. At the time of the making of this video, we're just over a year into the coronavirus and its effects on the world and its effects on America. I mean, this is an example of where, with all of our modern technology and science, we're caught by surprise. We're not able to overcome the curse, if you will. And I would suggest to you, based on my eschatology, that that's going to remain the same until the return of Christ. But we do have these epochs in human history. And some of their scientific conclusions, by the way, would seem utterly ridiculous to us. But to be fair, they were discovering a lot scientifically. But now there's a reaction. And you're going to see that over and over throughout history. You're going to see movements and reactions, and then counter-reactions. So one way to think of this is, I suggest to students in the realm of science, let's just take Vienna, for example, because certainly by the time we get to 1820, Vienna has already begun to be an important region of cultural influence. But by 1820, it is very strong. So let's say in Vienna, which does happen to be, as you get into the 1800s, if you want to study to be a doctor, for example, it's the greatest place you can go if you can afford to go there and study to be a doctor. So they certainly knew about science in Vienna. But let's say we've got some gentlemen who are, they may not call themselves this, but they're essentially pathologists. So they go out to a graveyard to study a dead body, which sometimes would happen for scientific reasons. You know, you run out of corpses to study, so they go out to this graveyard. Well, what they don't realize is this corpse has been freshly buried. Now, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit. I'm not saying this would necessarily happen. But this corpse has been freshly buried. They get it out of the ground to examine it, and the body is still twitching. They see a twitch in the body. Well, at this moment, where are their minds naturally going to go? They're going to go toward the supernatural. They're sitting in a graveyard late into the night. It naturally lends itself toward the supernatural. In fact, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes series is an example of this. Sir Arthur Boyle was actually trained as a doctor. But he became so fascinated with the otherworldly, he actually wasted most of his earnings from his books by being fascinated with the supernatural. He's kind of a quintessential example of what I'm talking about. So again, the idea is the pendulum goes so far towards science, so far towards thinking we can explain anything. There's a hard reaction towards spiritualism. And we want to look for that. Even as I'm making this video, and as Lord willing, we're coming out of the coronavirus, I think it's very likely that people are going to turn to spirituality because they're going to realize, and they are realizing, that science does not have all the answers. That there are answers that come from spiritual meaning that science doesn't provide. Now, along with this, it might make sense to you that there's going to be a fascination with that which is remote. There's going to be a fascination with that which is remote when it comes to romanticism. You're fascinated with the otherworldly, so you're going to have, during this era, some of the novels like the Frankenstein novels or Dracula novels will become popular. Remote could be spiritual, as it is in that sense, but it could also be from a past time period. So there could be a fascination with what had preceded the Common Era. So there begins to be a fascination, for example, with the late Middle Ages and knights' tales and chivalry. When these stories like the King Arthur legends begin to be written, things weren't as pleasant as they're portrayed to be in these stories, but there becomes a romantic longing for these past eras, for that which is remote. Now, one of the things we want to notice from this time period is that artists are becoming the new priest of Europe. So whereas in the past, when there was a turning towards spiritual things, it was just assumed, it was known it would always be Christianity. But now it's not the church leaders, it's not the priest, rather the artists are becoming the new priest of Europe. So, I'm saying to you as an artist, I'm admitting this to you, I don't think this is a good thing, it's just a reality, that increasingly artists become the new priest of Europe. And they are looked to for answers beyond just art. Wagner would be a prime example of this, he's sort of the embodiment of several of these ideas. Here Wagner is, as a German, he is wanting to celebrate his German music heritage. He has only moderate success in some of his early writing, but eventually lands on ancient legends of the German people and builds a complex and massive drama around Germanic legends. Once again, fascination with that which is remote. And he creates what he calls music drama. It would sound like opera to you, but it's this seamless unfolding of music that happens in several big productions, and it tells a story. It would be like Star Wars to us. But he's purposely building this production in such a way that it's celebrating German heritage. So you have the fascination with the remote on the German heritage, but he's creating something that's almost spiritual in a sense. It is spiritual, where he becomes one who foreshadows the later worshiping of the German race that will unfold in the 20th century. It's not surprising that Wagner is Hitler's favorite composer. Now, perhaps Wagner didn't see the full implications of where this is going, but this is what I mean by artists becoming the new priest of Europe. This is quite a dangerous development. And I would suggest to you that we still do this to some extent, where we look to popular figures, popular music artists for cues. We even sometimes look for their ideas related to theology. Now, when I say we, that maybe that's not you as an evangelical church leader, but within our churches, within the evangelical church, or even within our Baptist churches, we can sometimes end up looking to these artists for guidance instead of looking, of course, first and foremost to the Word of God, but then trusted leaders who have spent years studying the Word of God and can be trusted on such things. So, I would encourage you to do some thinking about this idea and the influence of these artists in this time period. The one other thing I would say about this period, and it really comes out of what I just told you about Wagner, is eventually in Romanticism, nationalism is on the rise. And nationalism at this point in time, it is not the full-fledged nationalism that we're going to see from the Germans preceding World War II, where a Christian nationalist is actually redefining Orthodox Christianity, rejecting, for example, the Jewishness of Jesus. That's not what we mean by nationalism at this point. Nationalism becomes more fervent passion for your country of origin. And part of this had to do with political circumstances. Germany becomes united, Italy becomes united. But even there, Verdi is credited actually for some of his operas that are written, helping unite Italy, telling in one opera the story of the Jews. And there are just powerful songs from that opera that the Italians associate with their own journey through tears to become a united people. So artists are working in the midst of these geopolitical circumstances, but nationalism is certainly on the rise. And look, when we say nationalism, if we're talking about in summertime watching powerful European soccer teams battle each other, hey, that's much better than World War. If we're talking about arguments over who's got the best musical art or who has the best visual art or who has the best food, this is all fine and good. In my view, nothing wrong with some nationalism rising up there. But we do certainly recognize and see in the 20th century that nationalism can certainly get out of control. Now, the final thing I want to mention to you about Romanticism is the Oxford movement. And I do want you to make note of the Oxford movement. This is another item I want you to take particular note of as we move toward the end of the semester. The Oxford movement rises up in England around the time that Romanticism starts. And so in some ways, it also could be seen as a reaction to Enlightenment, but more specifically in England, it has to do with geopolitical circumstances. Now, around 1820, the government of England has finally decided that they're no longer going to deny access to nonconformists, to those who were not willing to participate in the Church of England, not willing to take the Lord's Supper with the Church of England. This is huge because this is not just about Baptists. In fact, their primary concern would not have been Baptists, it would have been Roman Catholics. This means that Roman Catholics now can take that seat in Parliament and have more influence on the government. Now, if that sounds shockingly late in history, yeah, I would be in agreement with you. But that just shows you how much further ahead the Americas were in their conception of religious freedom, because this is not until around 1820 that this occurs. Well, at first, the Church of England leaders were panicked. They were panicked as to what the implications would be. They thought they were going to lose funding. And there's a series of writings that are called tracts that begin to be written by leaders within the Church of England, including some enthusiastic young leaders. And they're calling for a return to the fervency of their faith. They're eventually sort of rejecting the idea that they need money to experience revival. And there are some good things that come out of this. And these early tract writers were associated with Oxford University. Thus, it ends up being called the Oxford Movement. Now, what's very interesting about this is that even though the movement started with this very sincere desire to see the Church of England revived in its fervency, and even some of its Protestant roots, even though there was that desire at the beginning, where the movement actually went eventually was toward a fascination with liturgy and some of the interesting things in liturgy. Particularly one of the leaders in the movement became so fascinated with the Catholic liturgy that he converted to Catholicism. So through a series of events that it would have been hard to anticipate, for example, in the end, more money was given or specifically designated to revive the Church of England even after this vote had been taken. So some money goes into some local parishes to update the churches. And at the same time, this fascination with the liturgy leads to a greater use of choirs. It leads to a more frequent participation in the Lord's Supper. It leads to, if anything, a deeper commitment to the liturgy. And this sort of hit out of nowhere. In some ways, I see a connection to Romanticism because I can see how a fascination with that which is remote could be connected to a fascination with that which seems interesting or mysterious, with the appropriation of some of the Catholic liturgy ideas into the English liturgy. So in some ways, it's related to Romanticism, but in other ways, it would have been hard to guess that this would have happened in the way it did. I find it very fascinating because I think in many ways it is similar to what's happening in our own day and time in the early 2020s. This is an era that I call the post-Passion era. Now here's what I mean by that, to be clear. I've already mentioned to you that I remember when the Passion Movement, even before we were calling it the Passion Movement, was hitting our churches and we were doing this new worship music. I think it's had a tremendous run. I realize even as I make this video, the Passion Conference is still going on. We have some wonderful songs that come out of these various groups or communities like Hillsongs. Now, of course, we want to listen to each song individually and make sure it's theologically sound. But there's much good that's come out of this, and this movement's still alive in many respects. But just as when we were moving into what I call the Passion era in the early 2000s, well, traditional worship was still happening, blended worship was still happening. Well, in the same way, I think we're now in a post-Passion era. You've still got the Passion worship music, but there's now, from many of our leaders, some pushback in many ways to return to the hymns that have stood the test of time, or to turn to new music writing, such as the Gettys are producing, that has more of that timeless feel and sound to it, and the theology appears to be richer to us. So we're seeing in this day and time, out of nowhere, I certainly could not have guessed that it would have happened. When I came to NOBTS in 2009, I remember hearing people say, hey, the pendulum always swings back and forth. to be honest, I really didn't think it was going to happen. So I'm about as shocked as anybody that we're finding ourselves now in the midst of what I'm calling the post-Passion movement, which is another reason why I'm giving you plenty of information on the liturgy, because you might find some of these things to be interesting and connected to what you're doing in your local church. And I think you might find some parallels with how the Oxford movement also seemed to just rise up out of nowhere.